Hello, Manchester. Thanks for having us here, and good to see you guys. Really relevant topic. Just want to talk about authentication methods. This has been going on for quite some time, and it's one of my personal passionate areas. I've been in the authentication market for a long, long time, and I've been seeing no surprises sort of like emerge in this market. And believe it or not, user credentials are still sort of like the weakest link for any cybersecurity threat that's happening. You look at any breach reports or incident reports, whether it's Verizon's incident report, whether it's BT's incident report, or even WatchGuard. WatchGuard Technologies has a cybersecurity report that we publish every quarter. And it turns out that user credentials, especially username and passwords, are sort of like still the weakest link, and all cyber threats sort of like initiate and start with compromised credentials. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we're seeing in the industry, and today still there's organizations who haven't sort of like implemented a good cadence around multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication. So I just wanted to set the stage and sort of like give everybody an overview of what are the options that are available for organizations and enterprise users. So if you look at some of the key authentication methods, this is straight up from some of your favorite analyst slides. Gartner publishes multi-factor authentication and two-factor authentication technology deep dive overviews. And there's really 4 forms of authentication you can categorize in, each form of sort of like authentication can be put into one of these brackets. The first one is what's usually known as what you know, which is typically your password or knowledge-based authentication, something that you remember, something that you're aware of. And I think your pattern-based authentication, if you remember those captchas and the pictures that you see on certain e-banking sites, that's all knowledge-based authentication. The second form is where you're carrying something, which is something you have, which is where physical authenticators or sort of like tokens come into play. And that's, I think, as sort of like the market's evolved, it's also evolved into, the authenticators have evolved into from physical to software authenticators as well. And then you move into from something you have to something you are, which is your biometrics or your sociological aspects or physiological aspects tied in with other forms of authentication. And then finally, there's certain knowledge-based elements that work in the backend, or intelligence-based elements that work in the backend, which is where fraud prevention and adaptive authentication methods that take risk, et cetera, into consideration comes into play. So those are the 4 main categories of authentication. As I mentioned, token-based authentication is sort of like the most common authentication technique these days because primarily it enforces a second factor by means of something you know and something you have. And as smartphones have evolved, sort of like phone-based authentication has also taken over a good emergence. And I think when smartphones came into picture, or even before smartphones came into picture, there's always been a means of delivery of authentication, which is also very important. And out-of-band channel delivery of authentication is sort of like what's truly treated two-factor authentication. How many of you are aware with SMS-based authentication or still use SMS-based authentication? Yeah, quite a few. I mean, most of e-banking and financial institutions still enforce users to use, SMS-based authentication. Even some of what is the IRS body of UK still enforces SMS-based authentication. And I think that's sort of like where I'll highlight now is, when it comes to authentication tokens, what are some of the key considerations when it comes to security that needs to be taken into consideration? So 3 types of authentication options when it comes to tokens. The first one is obviously hardware tokens. This is something that, again, something you have, you carry it along with you. It's a piece of hardware that either generates a one-time password or holds a private key, which can be used to actually do digital signing or signature on behalf of the user. The second form is where it's not just carrying the hardware, but it's actually plugging in to actually verify physical presence, which is where USB or smart card form factor comes into play. And finally, the third one is using a smartphone, which everybody's carrying anyways. And I think there's trade-offs between each one of them. Obviously with hardware tokens, you have to carry an extra piece of hardware. There's cost associated with provisioning them. There's costs associated with supporting, help desk and maintenance around that. Whereas a smartphone or phone-based authentication is something that users are already, they have a smartphone. Everybody has a smartphone, so there's nothing additional to carry, and it's easier to provision because it can be done all online. However, when it comes to the trade-offs, obviously you look at the security, which is sort of like the big gorilla. Like, hey, how secure is going to be a smartphone versus a hardware token? That's really where the trade-offs come into picture. So let's look at the evaluation criteria. I think there's three main evaluation criteria that I recommend users, or especially CIOs and CTOs, to keep into consideration. Number one is obviously security, which is what are the use cases that you're trying to implement multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication for. Obviously, everybody recognizes that username and passwords are not secure. So what are the other means of additional controls that you can implement on top of standard username and password? So security is a big consideration. The second one is cost, which is not just the cost of procurement, not just the cost of the tangible dollars or pounds that you'll spend, but it's all about the hidden costs, which is what happens once it's deployed or how easy it is to be deployed. And then finally, the most important, and I think the dearest one, which I personally feel is the most important one as a security vendor, is user experience and simplicity. And I think that's something which is usually overlooked. I've been in the security industry for quite some time, and it's always implied that if something needs to be secure, there needs to be an additional step, or there needs to be an additional action that needs to be taken, and hence the burdens on the end user to sort of like leave it where they have to cope up with that extra step or that additional step that's been implied by a security solution. And security needs to be simple, and that's sort of like where I thrive in those three pillars. So that's why I feel like simplicity is where you need to focus on. So if you look at the evaluation criteria and sort of like, let's go through each one of them. The security obviously is the big one. This is a very, very busy and complex slide. But what this reflects is from NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, a body in the United States, which sort of like evaluates all authentication mechanisms, especially electronic authentication mechanisms, against an evaluation criteria. What you'll notice is the first factor of authentication on the left-hand side, and on the top is the second form of authentication. And when you combine those two, you get to a level of assurance which ranges from level 2 all the way to level 4. And each one of them sort of like help you satisfy the threat vectors that are coming in. These threat vectors could be eavesdropping, or could be shoulder surfing, or could be man-in-the-middle attacks, or signature-based attacks, phishing attacks, etc. And the more higher you go into the level of assurance, the better security that you're providing to your users, or satisfying security use cases for yourself. What you'll notice here is that the software cryptographic token, which is something that can be very easily leveraged on a smartphone, actually satisfies all the way to level 3 of assurance level, which means it can actually prevent and detect most of the threats that users feel. And I'll tell you why I'm using the term most of the threats, and why I'll use the term good enough security, which sort of like sometimes offends the CIOs and the CTOs. But it's actually very important to keep into consideration in that evaluation circle. Next thing I want to highlight is basically cost. Another important factor. As I mentioned, mostly with any multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, what's really overlooked is the hidden costs, which is how easy it is to actually get to market with the solution. Is it actually integrated with the ecosystem of applications that your users are going to use? What's easily relevant is obviously the hard costs, which is something that you have to pay to procure the solution. But then what's overlooked is the hidden costs, which is where the key is. And I think that's where I tell most of the users and enterprises is to focus on, especially cloud is becoming a disruptive vehicle. When it comes to management, when it comes to deployment, and when it comes to help desk and self-service, look for cloud solutions that can actually scale, that are easy and simple to manage, and then also easy and simple to maintain. So I think that's where sort of like the hidden costs come into play. And finally, user experience. As I mentioned, back in the day, it was okay to sort of like come up with hardware tokens or additional hardware that everybody had to carry. These days, everybody's carrying a hardware. That's your smartphone. So why not leverage the smartphone as that vehicle of adding an additional form of authentication? And then comes into what are the channels that you can implement with your smartphone or your second form of authentication, which is where I emphasize, like the traditional out-of-band authentication techniques like SMS and email-based OTP. Although they do use a second channel of delivery, they're now vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks, and they're now vulnerable to emulating the smartphone or compromising the smartphone, because there's not really any key or cryptographic content which is stored on the device for the delivery of those methods. So the one-time password that you get delivered using SMS simply needs to be intercepted by that route of delivery. If you're familiar with Signal 7 in the telecommunication protocol, obviously you're not. Kevin Mitnick, one of the most famous hackers in the world. He has a live video on YouTube, so you should watch it. It's very simple to sort of like just go over and hack a Signal 7 protocol in the telecommunication circuit, and then have somebody's one-time password for their e-banking account or for their enterprise applications delivered to a fooled or impersonated device or a phone channel, right? And I think that's where sort of like Gartner and some of the other vendors or analysts are predicting that that's where the market will shift towards smarter ways of delivery of that one-time password. So still one-time password is relevant, but it's the channel that needs to be secure, or there needs to be a handshake between who's sending that and who's receiving that. And I'll talk about that. And I think this is where, if you're using a traditional authentication method or an out-of-band authentication method like SMS or email, I think right now would be a right time to sort of like evaluate to move to more modern ways of authentication. So phone-based authentication, and I think one of the things that I want to highlight is push-based authentication, which is very common these days, provides a highly secure and a great user experience to end users. And I think that's where sort of like the market's moving towards. MFA needs to be hassle-free, and this is something that I personally preach to customers as well as a vendor. I think something that we focus on, building products which are secure but at the same time are providing great user experience. So number one, when it comes to management, ensure that you're not investing in server farms, and ensure that you're not investing in virtual or private servers. You can actually look for scalable cloud solutions, and trust me, the vendors today are actually going to leaps and bounds to making sure that their services are actually compliant with all the different regulatory needs and all the different specifications. When it comes to the token itself, again, phone-based authentication, but then tied with a greater user experience. Push-based authentication, which is very relevant today, where the user can actually log into an application, receive an acknowledgement, review the information in the acknowledgement, and then approve or discard that acknowledgement is very common. The signature is signed between the device where the authenticator is installed and then the server. So there's obviously trust between those two mechanisms, and I think that's the most easiest and the most user-friendly ways of authentication. The things that you need to focus on there is that, are you using event-based OTP versus time-based OTP? Obviously, time-based OTP is much more secure when it comes to event-based OTP compared to event-based OTP, right? And then finally, gaps in coverage, which is the ecosystem of authentication, which is obviously what are the applications that you're asking your users to use authentication to or multi-factor authentication to, which is where it becomes very critical, because if you're not satisfying the needs of the ecosystem, you're leaving holes for still the credentials to get compromised. So again, when it comes to the ecosystem, one of the user experience emphasized focuses is to ensure single sign-on, or ensure that the user signs on to using multi-factor authentication once, and then he can sort of like federate that identity multiple times within that ecosystem. So I think those are some of the key considerations. And again, if you look at that 3 evaluation criteria, look for a solution that fits that criteria well, a cloud-delivered MFA service that has flexible options, that satisfies your users' needs for both connected as well as disconnected authentication, but most importantly, provides good enough security that is usable. So I think with that, I'll leave you with that. We actually have a stand outside. We are here with Sys Group, who's our platinum partner. They're a very well-known MSP in the region. They're offering and sort of like offer managed services from WatchGuard, not only just multi-factor authentication, but also network security that extends to endpoints and wireless security. So come talk to us, and we'll be happy to show you a demonstration as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Well done. Can you take a seat? We'll just wait a couple of minutes while the previous speakers come and join me on the stage. Johnny?